Hello, this is Jay Carpenter of the PhoneWord Forum. It is Wednesday, October the 26th, 2011 at approximately 4 p.m. Eastern Time. And today we are talking with Mr. Richard Shockey of Shockey Consulting.
Tom.
Hey, Tom. How are you?
And this is Karen Mulberry. I just joined.
Hi, Karen. Jay.
Hi, Karen.
Hi.
Rich is on.
Hello, this is David Greenhouse.
Hello, David. How are you?
Good. How are you, Jake?
Very well.
John Evans, too.
Hi, John. How are you? We're just getting started, and I was introducing Rich and the topic. And the topic today is the possible sunset of the public switch telephone network and what impacts that might have on the toll-free industry's other considerations. And so there might be a few other people that join us today. I'd like to thank everybody for joining in on the conversation, and particularly like to thank Rich for being our guest participant today. And for those of you that are not familiar with Rich, he has been a long time central figure in the telecommunications and communications and media industry, both in North America as well as globally, heavily involved with the Internet Engineering Task Force, one of the basically authors of ENUM standards worldwide, was involved with Newstar for a number of years, is currently the chairman of the SIP Forum, as well as involved a fairly new member of what's called CISRIC, which the acronym escapes me at the moment, but I'm sure Rich will talk a little bit about that.
Security, Reliability, and Interoperability Council of the Federal Communications Commission.
Okay. But basically, I would just like to start off by acknowledging you, Rich, for your contribution to telecommunications and media in general. You are one of the people that I respect your opinion the most. We don't always agree on certain elements, but in general, your opinion has resonated with me, and your contribution, you spent countless hours and countless energy and effort and talent in crafting many key standards worldwide that have ushered in basically what we enjoy today in telecommunications and media delivery. So I acknowledge you for that. So.
And I have the gray hairs to prove it.
Absolutely. One of the things that I will always remember is there's, if you look up ENUM on Wikipedia and go to the Spanish site, there's way down at the bottom, there's about an hour-long video of Rich addressing Nokia and talking to them. Yeah, this is really buried deep in the weeds, but Rich is addressing Nokia, and this is, wow, 4 or 5 years ago. And at the end of the talk, Rich goes, and hey guys, there's one request that I have of you. Please put a hard drive in this phone. And if Nokia had just followed that advice, they would have had a leg up on the iPhone. And so, that was only one instance of your vision that I thought was quite valuable. And if they just followed that advice, it might have been a different outcome. So.
It wasn't a hard drive, it was a docking station. That was what I wanted them to do. It's actually still a problem with Apple, which is the Nokia and Apple still look at themselves as essentially consumer product marketing companies, and they really don't understand what people want to do with mobile phones in an enterprise environment. And Nokia just was in denial. They still are.
All right, so is there anything anyone would like to say before we get started? Any particular areas that you'd like to talk about on this call today? And just kind of pause for a minute before we get into it and give people a chance to express whatever's most important to you. All right. Well, and basically, Rich, go ahead and give us a summary of where we're at and what we're about to see.
Well, thank you very much. Again, my name is Rich Shockey, and I'm a private telecommunications consultant. I typically work with service providers, some equipment suppliers, as well as providing off-the-hand remarks to a variety of hedge funds and private equity groups of one form or the other who still track our industry in one form or the other. The thesis that I'm going to talk to you about today is what has been floating around Washington, which is where I live, by the way, which is this concept of the end of POTS, or the end of the PSTN. And what does this really mean, and what are the regulators and some of the carriers literally starting to talk about at this particular point? And it represents sort of an inflection point for those of us in the traditional telecommunications industry, specifically the voice side of the equation, which is still about $140 billion a year business for everyone, for the incumbents, the CLECs, the cable operators, and the mobile operators. If you can break out the voice portions by how they bill and charge, voice is still about probably a third to 40% of North American revenue. But we've got a problem with this particular point. First of all, the Federal Communications Commission, since the beginning of this administration, has been on a pathway to try and alter the economic structure of the industry somewhat by emphasizing that the role and function of the regulatory environment, and especially the use of intercarrier compensation and universal service funds, should be directed more towards broadband for Americans and not necessarily the underlying voice infrastructure and copper plant that we've basically dealt with and lived with, of course, for the last 35 years. That is going to come to a head literally tomorrow. The FCC is about ready to issue a report and order basically completely reforming the underlying economic structure by which universal service and intercarrier compensation is done, which tangentially, of course, involves the way 800 traffic is dealt with as well. And this is going to change the economics of the industry relatively dramatically. The basic outlines are that it goes to bill and keep, or potentially something like a 0.0007 termination rate for everything, which, as far as I'm concerned, really means bill and keep for all traffic.
Hey, Rich.
Yeah.
This is Jay. Would you mind just defining bill and keep? Kind of give a
you bill your customer, you keep the cash, you don't pay anybody else. It's the way we have transit and peering and really the IP in the internet side of the world, which is you have two carriers, typically an AT&T or British Telecom, and they look at the amount of IP traffic they exchange with each other, and they say, look, this is roughly equal. Why don't we just, we'll just exchange it without any billing methodology involved, and we'll just leave it at that. That's typically what peering is about. And we also, we know, by the way,
that contrasts to what's the regime or realm today?
Well, the regime that we have is that each call in the PSTN is billed potentially on some sort of regulated rate. So if a call originates from a Comcast network that terminates into Verizon, Comcast owes Verizon something, and that's a regulated termination rate, both on the interstate rates that the FCC governs as well as interstate rates that state PUCs do. And so you've got this complicated, billing and accounting in the telco OSS, BSS systems that is going to dramatically change very, very quickly. All right. So IP is handled typically on what's called transit peering basis, which is based on roughly the balances of traffic between two service providers. But you have this enormously complicated regime in the voice communications world that says, I'm going to bill for every single solitary call transaction. And right now, the cost of billing is probably more than the cost of the transport of the voice call itself. So this will change, or at least we'll find out tomorrow afternoon what it's going to look like. This will impose quite a different economic model on the industry, which tends, in my judgment, sort of pushes the envelope somewhat in the sense that you begin a series of dominoes that means that not just the economic structure of the industry changes radically, but the tactical underpinnings of the industry change radically. And that's really, to a certain extent, what I want to talk about. The concept that I bring forward here is that when the Federal Communications Commission, and I'm assuming that most of you saw the presentation that Jay circulated around. This was a presentation done by what's known as the Technical Advisory Council for the FCC commissioners themselves. I'm on a smaller one involving computer reliability and security that reports to the FCC's Homeland Security Bureau. But the formal FCC TAC is a recommendation to the commissioners themselves on a variety of issues. And the issue specifically that one of the issues that the FCC addressed this summer was what's called the end of the PSTN. And there's a lot of reasons people want to talk about this. And one reason is the changing economic nature of the industry. The second thing is really the underlying tactical basis of the PSTN is changing pretty radically. It is moving from the classic Class 5 time division multiplexing that has been the basis of the industry for 25 years, or 35 years in most cases, to an all-IP transport infrastructure. And we're really beginning to look at a fairly serious situation, which is the Class 5 switches which underlie the voice networks are now, in many cases, 25 to 30 years old. These are the old Nortel DMS 250s and 500s, and the classic classic Lucent 5ESS switches, which handle the switching of basically every phone call in North America, one form or the other. These things are starting to crumble, like our bridges, roads, and a lot of other things. So there is this very strong move, I believe, by the service providers in general to looking at what are we going to do with all this stuff, and how can we re-architect the E164 named voice communication network to make it more modern and potentially provide service providers and the industry with a better service. High definition voice, for instance, point-to-point video calling, rich text media instead of 140 character SMS. So this idea is not, when we talk about the end of the PSTN, we're not talking about taking mom's phone away. We're talking about essentially what I would call a technology swap out. And that the industry in general, which will have to include by definition the 800 industry, will need to actually look at what technically has to be done to undertake this. And there actually have been a fair number of discussions in downtown DC and other places, one way or the other, sort of postulating this. And frankly, you get a lot of nodding heads. It's scary business when you're talking about transforming the technical underpinnings of a $100 billion a year plus industry. It is going to be, it gets people nervous, and it should. But I believe on a bipartisan basis, this is where the FCC and Congress wants to take the industry. We do not want to continue to support a PSTN in and of itself. What we do is we want to support a national broadband network of which voice communications using E164 naming is a service component of that broadband. So this is where we're really at this particular point in time. So the question is, this is serious. This is a very large technology swap out, so to speak. because what we know is that the Class 5 time division multiplexing basis by which we're operating in the industry right now simply cannot be upgraded. It's not going to be upgraded. There's no technical basis for upgrading this equipment whatsoever. You cannot get parts for this equipment any longer. Line cards for the 5ESSs you can actually find on eBay. And the underlying signaling system 7 is even worse. This is now a complete spaghetti of networks inside both the CLEC mobile as well as incumbent networks that simply is going to have to be taken out at some particular point in time because it cannot and it will not be upgraded. So again, we've got this situation. There is a significant risk here. This equipment base ages more and more. There is, in my judgment, the real possibility that it's going to kill somebody. Namely, a Class 5 switch's backplane will toast or fry literally at some particular point in time in a major metropolitan area. A 911 call will not be able to be successfully routed. And ultimately, someone may in fact die is what it's going to boil down to. And that will bring all the regulators down on our industry's heads, and that's something that, frankly, we need to avoid at all possible costs. The other issue is that the people who actually operate this equipment, I mean, they're retiring. It's the skilled resources necessary to maintain this class of equipment is evaporating before our eyes. And I think collectively we need to understand that our industry is leeching customers to over the top, Skype, Google Voice, other non-traditional, non-facilities-based carriers, and part of this is because they've got a modern plant. This is certainly true of cable operators. Cable operators are, winning an increasing share of the industry because DOCSIS 3 and the modern plant that they have in place is pretty darn good, and they are able to operate it at significantly less cost than a traditional incumbent landline carrier. So the concept is, what are we going to do at this particular point? And that's sort of the discussion at this particular point. We need to break this out into several issues, which is the central issues are, one, economics. I mean, how do we do this sort of transition that is economically sensible, given the fact that there continues to be substantial as well as marginal decline in the voice communication service revenues. Our industry, by and large, is flat in the revenue side, namely the increase in mobile subscribers and mobile data revenue has not yet been able to offset the decline that we're seeing in voice. But the regulators have their own issues, which is, what are the aspects of the current PSTN that the industry and regulators want to preserve, essentially the sort of social contract here. What is universal service for E164 named traffic, including 800? How does this actually going to work? And then last but not least, what is the technical aspects of it? Because you're talking about really a lot of equipment and a lot of technology that has to be swapped out. It's the switches, it is the end of SS7, it is a discussion of how the numbering databases, both the LERG, the NPAC, and the 800 databases are structured and queried in some way, shape, or form. There has been very little, if any, discussion about that. Certainly at the commission, one way or the other, but these are issues that are going to be raised relatively quickly, because in my judgment, the planets are beginning to align. As we see both the regulators and some of the incumbent carriers basically saying it's time to really, we got to scrap this stuff because it's going to blow up. What are we going to do? And that's going to, the discussion has been, do we need a plan to present to, the industry as well as the regulators on how we would essentially turn off pods and restructure the PSTN in an all-IP communications world. So that's where we're at right now. A lot of this has been, people have been sitting on the sidelines because we really don't know what the financial structure of the industry will look like until tomorrow. What does the FCC really want to do? Does it actually want to do things like mandate all IP interconnection for voice traffic among all carriers? I mean, that would be an incredibly radical transformation, namely that 800 call traffic would have to be inter-exchanged between origination and termination on IP circuits using SIP. And by the way, a great deal of that actually has been going on now for quite some time. You can bet your dollar that cable operators and a lot of the wireless operators are interconnecting using SIP protocol-based IP interconnection right now. And I think the FCC's data was, they think it's about 32% of all voice traffic is VoIP at this particular point. And when the mobile operators moved to a voice over LTE platform in the 2012-2013 timeframe, that's going to clearly break the 50% mark, which means that the pressure to retire the existing technical plant will accelerate by orders of magnitude, which means we have to begin the planning now. That's essentially my thesis here on what I think this conversation is really all about. So the discussion would be, do we need to, coalesce our industry and, the various components of it, both technical, operational, obviously the various segments of the industry, including 800, get people at least talking about it and realize that something like this is going to happen no matter what anybody thinks, so to a certain extent. This is not if, it's when. And then actually look at what would the timelines be. Some people have suggested 2018 as a potential time frame for actually turning it off. This is not as radical as it sounds. In my judgment, we have about 85% of the technical protocols in place necessary to do it, but it is going to be a bunch of gotchas out there that we need to talk about. And the numbering databases are one of them. The other aspects would be like LibB, for instance. How is fax to be treated on the all IP networks? There's a whole host of these issues inside the technical fabric of the PSTN that ultimately needs to be addressed. So that's
Rich, for those that don't know what LibB is, would you mind?
Blind information database. Right. It provides a lot of functions about who actually who's the subscriber for a particular line or a telephone number. It's also used in 900 call completion and but nobody uses 900 any longer. The LibB is in fact an important component. It's also prepaid calling and a variety of those other issues as well as LibB.
Yeah, I'd like to modify that description just a little bit because you said who's the subscriber for the number, and in my view, it's really who's being billed for.
You're right.
Yeah,
you're
charges.
Right.
And
who's being billed for the charges? Right.
Yeah, who's being billed for the charges, which in my view is radically different than who's the subscriber for the number, because all you have to do is look at a family plan to see where the collapse of who's the subscriber and who's being billed, sort of falls apart.
Sure.
If you've got 4 people in a family all on the same family plan, it looks like dad might be the subscriber for the number when it's really mom, daughter
right.
or son.
You're absolutely right, and that's exactly what's that's how that operates in an all IP real-time communications world is I don't know. I mean, no one's working the problem as far as I can tell. So the other aspect of this is that the conversion of the classic the classic POTS PSTN network also nicely dovetails into what the Commission has been working very extensively on, which is an all IP-based 911 system, next generation 911. That technical work has been going on now for 3 years or more, again with complete bipartisan support. The PSAPs, NENA, Homeland Security Bureau and the FCC, and DHS, Department of Homeland Security at the cabinet level. There's a whole structure there that, and a roadmap for bringing all of our emergency communication systems onto an all IP infrastructure based on SIP and ultimately long-term evolution for the mobile component if they can ever figure out what to do with the D block. But that's another long-term seminar right there.
Well, would you just briefly define or explain D block for those?
D block is the portion of the 700 megahertz spectrum auction that was unresolved when the auctions were done, 4 years ago. Mm-hmm.
Right.
It was supposedly for public service networks. The question was how do they actually implement it? There was one proposal where it would be sold to the carriers so long as it was shared with first responders and public, safety agencies one way or the other. That fell apart. There's a bill that Senator Rockefeller has basically promulgated saying, well, we'll just give it to the public service agencies and the first responders, police, fire, et cetera, et cetera. But no one's come up with any way of how to fund the build out. And the PSAPs are, because typically they're funded by state and local governments, they have incredible financial pressure on them one way or the other to figure out how to do this. And it's not going to happen anytime soon because of the funding issue, unless Congress and the Commission can come up with a new plan, but I don't think that's going to happen, not in an election cycle in this town. But the technical
by the way, there's an interesting situation here in Arizona. The city of Mesa has decided to set up their own private 4G network, their own private LTE 4G network to run all their municipal communications, including
right.
And so that's kind of an interesting development here locally that I'm watching.
Yeah, whether they're using WiMAX or I mean, basically the entire industry is going to go to long-term evolution. I mean, that's what Verizon and AT&T are using for their commercial offerings in 2012. I think certainly the FCC has essentially mandated LTE for next generation 911 radio access networks and stuff like that. And by the way, what you get with this, by the way, is the ability for PSAPs to get both, not only just high-quality voice, but potentially video, as well as text messaging delivered to the PSAPs directly. Namely, if
Rich, would you briefly explain what a PSAP is for those that might not know?
I beg your pardon?
Would you briefly explain what a PSAP is for those that might not
Public
know?
Service Access Point. It's it's where the call terminates when you dial 911, based on the programming inside of the Class 5 switch, which indicates where the location of the that's trying to explain. It's a very complicated process, but the switches that route the call essentially access another database that says this number is at this geospatial location. Basically, it's a street address, and then they use that to dispatch the fire truck or the police truck or one way or the other. So the question has been, can you expand the capabilities, the technical capabilities of PSAPs to accept multimedia, namely something other than voice? And I think clearly they want to do text first at this particular point. And this would be text based on SIP, by the way, Session Initiation Protocol. It would translate the SMS message at the soft switch into a SIP message, which would then be sent to the PSAP. But clearly, given the fact that we now have a proliferation of smartphones with forward and or backward-facing cameras, the idea that, gee, you could, film a robbery in progress and hit 911, and the police would actually get a film of the robbery in progress, which I think is a great idea. This sounds great.
Yeah, could be the best defense if, my wife is at home and hears somebody knocking at the, or, try to break in.
It gets even better because, say, for instance, you could potentially set up a home security system with motion detectors in one way or the other and cameras, and those film clips could also be sent to the PSAPs. It's the idea that multimedia communication can be directly sent to a public safety access point, which could be used to dispatch the appropriate first responders. And of course, the idea of expanding this to ultimately data, where it would be real-time communication of EKGs or whatever while you're in the ambulance. I mean, this is all possible now with IP-based communication. So all of these things tend to line up very, very, very nicely. But that work on the IP ES911, that's actually pretty well done, except for the funding problem. But it also then, once again, brings up how are we going to deal with really the underlying infrastructure. And we're talking about now billions and billions of dollars of stranded assets that have been fully depreciated but are beyond depreciation. And they're like, having a, Ford Fairlane someplace, and somebody says, do you really want to put a new transmission in this? I really don't think so. It's just, and like I said, you can't even buy the parts for these things any longer. So this is where we're at, and though not directly related to the 800 industry, it is a vital part because Jay, you correct me, if I recall, 40% of all toll calls are still 800 derived in one form or the other. So this is a significant revenue to the industry.
Yeah, I don't know what the current figures are, but I think toll-free traffic on toll-free numbers is certainly a significant part of the the voice minutes that are chargeable or billable.
Right.
And the toll-free numbering requires that there's a lookup in, via the service control points into the SNS 800 database, and all of that, as far as I can tell, is, anchored to the public switch telephone network. So,
well, I mean, that's the interesting thing is the 800 SMS, guess what? It's got to be restructured because you're not going to do an SS7 TCAP call any longer. That's something that, I've been personally involved with sort of the stuff for a long, long time, but that's really what you're talking about here is to find, the routable information on an 800 number, you're not going to be doing TCAP any longer because, believe me, irrespective of the age and decrepit nature of the Class 5 switch infrastructure, the cost burden and non-extensibility of SS7 is equally a pain to everyone concerned. And this, by the way, is including the mobile and the cable operators. It's just awful. It's non-extensible. We can't build new service offerings. We can't add value to 800 services because we're stuck on a platform that is not going to grow the way the industry has over the last couple of years.
Rich, would you just explain or define TCAP for those that might not be familiar with that acronym?
Transaction Control Access Protocol. It's basically the query mechanism from the Class 5 switch to the service control point, which is the repository of all the data regarding routing information for the phone number. And the service control point, by the way, is the database attached to the switch, and it aggregates the information from multiple sources. It, first of all, aggregates the LERG, the Local Exchange Routing Guide. It aggregates the data from the NPAC, the Number Portability Administration Center. It also aggregates the data from the carrier's internal routing information, basically saying, well, this phone number is actually local to me, so I know how to do with it. It's basically the routing databases is what it boils down to. Those are the
Rich, do you think, thank you for that explanation. Do you think that it would seem to me that it would be possible right now that if when a call is placed to an 800 number or a toll-free number from a smartphone or wireless device, it would seem to me that if the carrier could take a look at that call and do a point-to-point connection right now, if they in fact were the rest board for that, the termination point for that toll-free number. So in other words, if I'm an AT&T customer and my 1-800 phone word is rest board with AT&T, it would seem to me that they could currently do an IP-to-IP connection right now without involving the PSTN. Would you say that's correct, or?
That's a question of what is happening in some networks. Is that there are enum databases being deployed as an alternative to a classic Tekelec Eagle service control point, and in fact they're aggregating IP data into these new IP SCPs, if you want to call them that, and they can in fact ultimately do that. There are multiple operators out. Well, actually, I can actually say it now because we all know this is actually true, which is the cable operators are doing this, for some time. They do a little bit different technique. If you can actually do a search on Google, go for Pure Connect, which is the cable industry's internal answer to all IP routing. Yes, it's an enum registry of one form or the other, which is then locally cached into the MSO's network. But what they've been doing for quite some time on traditional toll calls is essentially do a TCAP query to SS7, and they return back what's called a SPID, a Service Provider Identification Code. So what happens is if a call comes into Cox's network, and they do a lookup and they find the underlying SPID, Service Provider Identification Code, for that terminating provider, if they see that it's Comcast, for instance, then they route the call on IP. They do not in any way, shape, or form touch the traditional circuit switch network, which they're actually permitted to do, which, by the way, costs the incumbent carriers, AT&T and Verizon, about, I think it's up to $300 million a year in lost revenue for inter-carrier compensation, but there's nothing AT&T and Verizon can do about that. They certainly know it's going on. They can't object to it. In fact, they're trying to figure out how to do it themselves. So there's two forms of IP-based routing in a modern world. Either you can transition using service provider identifications codes and then have sort of fax each other a private little note about where to interconnect with each other, or you ultimately go to some form of phone number to URI resolution, which is, I don't want to get into the gory details this late into the call, but it's typically known as a session border control at the edge of the VoIP network. And
the first method is private federations, right?
Essentially private federations. That has been going on now for many, many years. Certainly the last 5 years, and it's accelerated quite a bit. And certainly I believe the mobile operators have been doing quite a bit of this internally among themselves, whether they're using IP or continuing to use circuit switch technology. I can't go into the details of that, though it is pretty obvious to anyone that AT&T and Verizon, and now probably Sprint, will IP interconnect their LTE networks. That's a given. That's not even a debatable function any longer.
Yeah, and that's regardless of whether provider enum happens or not. That's going to happen one way or the other.
That will happen one way or the other, but if we do see this move towards an end of PSTN, what this provider enum system is going to look like, how it's designed, how does it get paid for, how is it deployed, how is 800 going to work with it, how is 911, 411, 311, and all the other N11s out there be integrated to it, is a tactical issue that has yet to be fully debated at this particular point. So, Jay, since we're running close to the hour, if there's any questions, I'd be happy to take them now.
Hey, Rich, this is Robert Schaefer.
Bob, how are you, brother? How are you?
I'm good. I guess more a comment than a question.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that culminates what you were just talking about as far as changes is what is going to be the authoritative registry or registries for routing E164.
Yep. It certainly is. And I obviously get asked this question all the time. Does it have to be one, or can it be many, or one way or the other? You can certainly aggregate multiple registries, I think. I mean, that's certainly obviously what's happening, today. I think the industry would probably be better off at some particular point in time if there was at least a solution, or less than three, more than one. But again, it's how this gets decided is something that's going to have to be worked out by the industry. In the various industries. Sure.
PhoneWord forum before last, we had a conversation with Tim Denton, who was the project manager for the enum trials in North America. And
that's Commissioner Tim Denton, by the way. Of the
Commissioner Tim Denton, that's correct. Timothy Denton, and when you put the commissioner.
The Honorable Timothy Denton.
He wasn't commissioner at the time of the trial.
No, he was not commissioner at the time.
He was not commissioner at the time of the trial. But anyway, what kind of emerged out of that conversation was, because we were looking at a piece that he did in 2006 about registries and sorry about that, about registries and some of the governance issues and some of the pressures that are building up from different points. But what kind of emerged from that is the authoritative registry that might emerge is Facebook.
No way. I don't believe it.
Here's the point of that comment. Is if you take the term registry and kind of broaden your definition of it, Facebook, Twitter, Skype, effectively those are registries.
No. It's just no way. No, it's not going to happen. And
well, and here's the other point, and
I actually hear this all the time, by the way, which is, what do we need phone numbers for, Facebook and Twitter? Well, I can guarantee you that the Federal Communications Commission and the state commissions are just simply not going to allow that ultimately to sort of happen. They're going to take market share, away one way or the other, but to believe for an instant that E164 numbers are all going away and we're just going to have our Facebook IDs on our cards, I don't believe
No. I totally agree that, the value proposition surrounding E164 telephone numbering is strong, and it's, part of the fabric of society. But the ability for, Facebook and maybe maybe Google Plus and Twitter and so forth to fold in telephone numbering as part of the mix of the authoritative registration for people, I think is, there's a possibility there. So I don't think that I'm going to be running around, using my Facebook handle or Skype handle or whatever as my, key identifier. But there's been a report, in the press that basically has said that Larry Page, what is he, the CEO of Google now, his obsession is identity management.
Well, he's obsessed with a lot of stuff, but
but
what I do know is that AT&T and Verizon's lobbyists in Washington are at least as good as, and not better than, Google.
Well,
and I know those guys too.
Yeah, I would say that's probably more than true. But the point is that I think for those of us that have been in the conversation around enum for a decade or more, we have a certain definition, a certain view of registry. And all I'm asking is that, there might be a broader view of what a registry is, or an authoritative registry, which has been the elusive holy grail of a lot of effort for a long time. So,
look, I understand the point, but I've been around the industry long enough and have had enough conversations with both incumbents, CLECs, regulators, and the otherwise, and the idea that a private firm would be authoritative for essentially a national resource like E164 is just beyond inconceivable. It's just not going to happen.
Although ICANN is a private entity.
Hey, Jay.
No, it's not.
This is Robert. One thing you might think about, and I don't want to debate this on the call, but just to think about, is rather than you characterizing the social networking as a broader view, I think it's really a different view. Because think about what the relationship, if any, is between those social networks and E164 numbering, and the answer is not very much of a relationship.
True. At this point, however, one thing that is naturally occurring is there's occurring this federation. I would call it a federation between and among Twitter, Facebook, Skype, etc. So, what's that?
Jay, I went through back when who was it? Dave Barber was CTO at the FCC, and he tried to mandate AOL, Yahoo, and Microsoft Instant Messaging, and it was a complete and utter failure. It totally was. And if I do know anything from my experiences with Google and some of these folks, especially Skype, they're committed to their silos. They have no interest in federating with anyone. But AT&T does have interest in federating with other people because they understand the value of federated networks, which is the silo does not work over time. You can the interconnection between AT&T and Verizon is the hallmark, even though it's mandated by Section 251, 251C of the Act and all the other garbage that goes with it. But you have $100 billion in revenue, not market cap. That's, actual daily yearly revenue based on the fact that the industry interoperates and interconnects with each other. And that is, again, one of the social aspects of the PSTN that I think everybody's trying to preserve here under the circumstances because, again, I've had this argument with my technical colleagues for a long time. The phone numbers, they're not going to go away. And The challenge, of course, for the industry is to continue to make them relevant, because if we don't do something like turn off pods eventually, then we are looking at a pack where communications becomes fragmented and siloed into Skype and then Google over here and Microsoft over there and one way or the other, and that's not in the national interest, especially when we need to preserve 911. I just don't see it.
No, actually, Rich, I agree with pretty much everything that you've said, and I just think there are some subtleties and some different dimensions of this that, until they're articulated, it kind of looks like we're talking about apples and oranges, and we might be talking about, some blend. So.
Well, from the perspective now, which is, given the fact that we may, this is not going to happen tomorrow by any stretch of the imagination. This is a discussion that is probably going to go on throughout 2012 in one form or the other. But we are, at least in my judgment, and I've seen a lot of this discussion for the last 10 years, we're about as close to something like a end of POTS that I've ever seen before. And that actually does mean what is going to be the IP access to the 800 SMS. What is it going to look like? And how does the 800 SMS adapt itself and become relevant in an all IP interconnected world? That I think is, yeah, go ahead.
And so far, Rich, I'm gathering that you're not hearing anything that's out there that's saying, okay, well, this is the path forward for SMS 800 and toll-free numbering and so forth.
Well, it's I would characterize the discussions that I've seen in D.C. at this particular point as you're getting a bunch of guys sitting in a law firm on K Street, okay, and it's some of the usual suspects. I mean, companies that everybody knows who they are, and they're all sort of staring at each other like, the shootout at OK Corral. But, and of course, yes, it does involve AT&T and Verizon and XO and Comcast and, some of these other folks, because everybody realizes that the current situation is unsustainable. The question is, how are we going to do it? And what are we going to do about it? And at least up until recently, there's a lot of it is, until the regulators basically sort of, let people know what they're really thinking. Would they go so far as to mandate all IP interconnection? Well, then it's off to the races. It'll be like, starting gun at the Preakness. Of course, there'll be a zillion lawsuits, one way or the other. It'll be like net neutrality, because the rural carriers in particular, by the way, this is essentially the apocalypse. Right. The rate of return carriers in rural America, many of which would derive as high as 60% of their revenue from a combination of ICC and USF funds, are going to be severely impacted. And we're using free conference, by the way, to do this call, and if the industry goes to bill and keep, they're finished. There's just no way around it. The free conference services, as they are currently constituted, the business model will not work. This isn't going to happen because there's no revenue model. They can't use inter-carrier compensation splits between, the Navajo Indian Nation and whomever to actually do call termination any longer. It'll be a bill and keep model, so the free conference call industry is essentially finished. Finito, done. It will have to go to a different kind of a model because it's financially unsustainable at this particular point. And the traffic pumping, the ghost calling, all of the other little, tricks, all the arbitrage goes away. Now, actually, I think that's a good thing, but, obviously there are others who have countervailing views, as they say. But we're about as close as we can reasonably get to doing something like that, I think.
Yep. I agree, and I appreciate you sharing your insights and experience and analysis with us, Rich. Does anybody have any comments or anything before we wrap up the call? Well, one thing that I would like to add, well, Rich, is there anything you'd like to say to kind of...
No, I'm fine, Jay. Happy to participate. I've hoped I've given, I haven't talked too much. And at least sort of a little bit of view from, this part of the world where, things are at least, something's going to happen tomorrow. Who knows what at this particular point. I'm taking side bets with my communications bar friends on how many pages the report and order will look like. Greater than 500 is now an even bet.
Wow.
Yeah.
Bedtime reading.
Oh, it's gonna ruin a lot of lawyers' weekends. I'll tell you that.
Fun stuff.
Yeah, they're gonna have to read this thing.
One point that I would like to add, I just noticed recently in a little news release, is that Australia looks like they're going through the same exercise. The Australian government is rolling out an initiative that looks to me like they're planning to shut down their PSTN within the next, or at least the copper plant within the next 10 years. And they just did a deal with Telstra to kind of usher that in. So
$40 billion, and they'll basically go to a national fiber access to the home for basically all of Australia. Yeah, it's pretty slick. We could never do it here, but.
Wow. Our next PhoneWord forum at the end of November, which I believe is November 30th, we will be talking about some things that are going on in Australia, including this their version of the retirement of the PSTN. We'll also be talking about their market-based allocation method for their version of toll-free numbering. I'm hoping to get some of the folks from Australia on the call so that all of us in North America and elsewhere have an opportunity to chat with them a bit as to what their experience has been. Unfortunately, it's going to require anybody from Australia getting up at 6 a.m. or 7 a.m., depending on the time change. I haven't quite figured that out, to participate on the call. So I don't know what their participation will be like, but we will have an opportunity to speak directly with some of the folks from Australia, or if not, then we'll just kind of talk about what's been happening in Australia and what might happen. So that's the topic for next month. And basically, unless someone has something else to say, it is the top of the hour. I appreciate everybody's participation. This is recorded and will be available for listening via dial-in. It is my intention within the next 30 days or so that I'll have these PhoneWord forums posted on the web so that people can listen to them. And I deeply appreciate everybody's participation, and guess we'll call it a day.
Jay, how quickly are we able to listen to this recording? I had to step off there for about 15 minutes.
You should be able to listen to it as soon as we hang up.
Okay. Well, thank you, Jay. Thank you, Mr. Shockey.
Thank you.
Bye.
All right, goodbye.